Sounds pretty good, sleeping in. Okay, we'll get going. All right, so today the topic I'm going to talk on is just kind of building a pollinator garden. We're going to talk about more or less, at the end of the day, really any type of flower could be beneficial to a pollinator or a set of pollinators. We're going to talk about a few specifics down the way, but the concept and the major key takeaway I want you to have today is to understand that building a pollinator garden is about diversity. It's about creating a diverse set of plants in color, shape, size, and ideally, if we can, putting a focal point towards native pollinator plants, things that are going to fend really well in a harsh climate. As we get into the heat of the season, which is coming on now, a lot of your annual flowers, if you plant annuals, not all of them can handle this hot summer. So pollinator garden is a good way to put in some plants that are going to provide you color, pollination, and essentially something that looks aesthetically pleasing. So pollinator garden is going to support bees. It's going to support wildlife as well. Hummingbirds, while they're not as prominent here, bats are also primarily utilizing flowers for nectar. We can support moths, which are something that a lot of people don't realize that are immense pollinators. And there are a lot of plants that only bloom at night. So we need to be supporting things, even though they don't really have visual impact to us, or maybe they're not things that we think about. Creating a pollinator garden is about helping, at the end of the day, create an ecosystem and help support nature and do our part to let plants and insects thrive. The great thing about being where we are is that we have something that can bloom year round. There's only a handful of weeks in any given year where we're going to have a hard time getting something to bloom or something that can't bloom. And that's going to be that late winter when we get that one cold snap, two cold snaps that are, either Texas torrential snow or our ice or a freeze. But we can still have something blooming all the way up until those points and very shortly thereafter. So we want to make sure, because we have that climate, that we're utilizing the opportunity to build a garden that has color year-round. This is also going to help us improve food production. So if any of you are vegetable growers, fruit growers, pollinators, color and diversity flowers are a major component in being able to grow food pesticide-free. You're basically creating a small ecosystem that brings in things to do the pollination. It also attracts in predators, things that regulate nature. We have a lot of insects that are drawn to some of the similar plants that even are pollinators that are also predators. They feed off sugars and they'll use nectar, like the red paper wasp. Some of your parasitic wasps, they feed on other insects, but they also pollinate. So you have some things that are very, very versatile that we can bring in by having a diverse set of plants. Just like anything else we grow and most things in our climate, we have just our core components of what does the plant need to grow. Most all your pollinator plants are going to require full sun, but full sun here is not the same as full sun in other places. So ideally, if I'm going to set up a pollinator bed, or really anything for that matter, that are going to be more delicate plants, I'm going to try to choose, if I can, somewhere that's going to get morning to mid-afternoon sun, avoiding the really hot afternoon sun if I can, or using placement as understory plants under other things that might help provide some shade, because that's also going to help me with water usage. If you plant a lot of annuals, sometimes they can get really thirsty depending on what you have. Because a lot of them are not really big plants. They don't have really deep root systems. While other pollinator plants, they do. and they'll withstand drought. We're going to talk about some good options for drought-tolerant plants as we go. We want to make sure that we don't have low spots where we're planting these out, because most of these plants are not going to like to have a lot of wet feet. A lot of your more tender green growth plants are going to be more susceptible to root rot and other types of root diseases. If you don't have a pollinator bed, I'll take my own advice even, is start small. Create something small, become successful with it, and you can always grow it. And if you create something small, it also shows you that you can do a lot with a little space. You can get a lot of benefit in one section, and you don't necessarily need some giant pollinator garden. For me, I find it, because mine is more intermingled in with my vegetables and some of my fruits, that I have sections that we develop so that they're spaced all over the area, and I'm bringing pollinators not just to one bed, I'm enticing them to go through some of the other things that would get benefit for them, but they might not necessarily go to or seek out. So I'm promoting, it's one of the things that I find, especially for people that grow vegetables, there's always the complaint, there's no pollinators. Right now, everyone is complaining about not having pollinators on the online groups. There's no bees, but we also have to consider, even though, like for myself, I'm experiencing the same thing, I have lots of color, I have lots of options for pollinators, but sometimes, even though we as the user or the person doing the doing, we can't control what's happening in nature. And up until yesterday, what have we been facing so far this season? Drought. Very, very early drought, which is, this year you were supposed to have like the severe El Nino, so we're going to see a lot more drought-like conditions most likely as we go through the year. Well, drought affects nectar and pollen. Anybody in here ever kept bees? That plays a huge role into honey production, because if we're getting excess rain or a really wet season, pollens and nectars are not as prominent. They get washed out. Whereas if we have a dry season, there's not enough moisture and sugar development in plants, and then you don't really have, they're flowering, but there's not enough resources in the flower to actually do any good. So starting out small, dialing it in, and spacing it out is important. One of the major components of creating a pollinator garden, and I'm guilty of this mistake myself even right now, is planting singular plants. There are some plants that we're going to talk about today that would be perfectly fine to have by themselves, but ideally we want to plant in clusters. We want groupings, because if we only have one plant and our goal is to bring in pollinators and an abundance of them, if we don't have enough of a given plant, then we're not really helping anything out. Now, there are, like I said, some plants we'll talk about as we go. We only need one of, because the size and flowering aspect of it, it's going to be plenty to do the same as a grouping of other plants. So you also, if let's say you have 5 to 7 of a same plant, but if you scatter them all over, it's less attractive. When you have, people are just like insects, pollinators are just like us. They're going to go the path of least resistance. They're going to find a place where they can find an abundance of something, and they can keep coming back to it. Hummingbirds are one. Every year I get hummingbirds at home, and I'll get like one, and I'll put out a feeder, I'll do everything right, but I'll never get a whole bunch of them. So somewhere around me, somebody's providing more than I am, and it doesn't mean I won't get any. I just might not see an abundance of a given thing. So I have to keep that in mind. Now, when I say avoid scattering, it doesn't mean that we should scatter different types of plants. That we should not have multiple plantings. We should have multiple sections. We don't want one giant block of a given thing. We want a nice size grouping, and we can repeat that grouping in a bed, or we can do a small bed with a grouping, and we can repeat that same grouping maybe across the way, like on the other side of the room in this instance. So it is important to have an abundance of something. So for me, it's better to target, if there's something I'm really trying to attract specifically, to make sure I have an abundance of the plants that that specific type insect is going to need and focus on that versus just having a ton of different things, one here, one there. The next thing that we can do, we have to think about our space. So if we want to plant in groupings or clusters, we also have to consider layering. This same concept is very important to me, even as a vegetable grower. I don't have a whole lot of space. So how do I maximize my space by and be able to plant all these different plants, but in a limited area? And that's layering. So before we get in there, we need to think about mature size of plants. I mean, how many of you have planted something and never paid attention to how big it actually gets? I mean, everybody's done it at some point. I still do it all the time. Sometimes I just don't care. But I've got to think about how big is something going to get. So in the back, let's say I have like a fence line, and this previous picture here, you can see here, it's even happening here. It's layered, tiered down to where everything is maintainable, especially if there's plants in here that need deadheading or maintenancing. You mentioned earlier red salvia, things that multiply. If we don't want things to get crazy overcrowded, so at some point we do have to do a little bit of maintenance. So by layering in sizes and heights, it makes maintaining a bit easier. So here we can have tall plants in the back, we can have medium plants in the front, we can have low ground cover growing, like 8 to 12 inch tall plants in the front. Same concept goes if you have, let's say you have an island bed in your yard or somewhere where you can access all sides. Depending on the depth, you can build that same concept. You build circular or whatever shape the bed is, and you build tall, medium, and large outward, creating kind of like a dome effect. Not only does that maximize space, but it improves visibility. So how many of you ever overplanted something like in your vegetable garden or something that was harvestable, and then you couldn't see what you needed when it came down to harvest? The same concept that goes for pollinators. Not every pollinator finds things by scent. Some find by sight or color that they can see in their own type of vision. So we need to make sure that things are visible. And that's one way that layering can benefit you, is that colors and shapes and sizes are very visible. It's also important because it does improve growth. The example that I gave earlier today was, have any of you ever planted like a pollinator, like bought like a packet of mixed pollinator seeds that you just scatter out? Well, you don't really know what you're getting. You know what you're getting, but you don't know what's going to grow where. And while that's perfectly fine and that can work in a very wide open setting where sun is totally accessible, or it's in an open space, that might not work somewhere like along a fence or a small bed. Because what's going to happen, I may have tall plants grow in the front, low plants in the back, and then those tall plants create shade. They don't allow that other plant to get enough photosynthesis or resources, and then it might grow, but maybe it doesn't bloom. So then I've got a plant that's blooming or growing, but it's not blooming. And that kind of defeats the purpose of what we're going for. So being very intentional can help you be successful in maximizing your blooms and just the growth in general by looking at it in layers. Does that make sense? Any questions so far?
I have this huge clump of sunflowers that came back volunteer this year, and they are like right up in the front. And then I have another volunteer. Well, I planted it and it came back an antelope milkweed.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that they're gonna shade it out, too much. So
Are they tall sunflowers or short ones? They're like 6 feet. But you never know though. I mean, and it's something that tall, it might actually provide just enough shade to relieve some stress. So whereas if it was like a lower, like knee-high type sunflower, might actually shade it out some. So I mean, it might be a blessing. You never know.
Yeah.
So you just got to kind of see what happens.
Yeah.
So another concept that we want to focus on is if we're going to plant in layers and we're going to plant in groupings, we want to think about, I'm not going to say eliminating symmetry, but we want to keep it we're not trying to match things and make it all perfect. When we're thinking about attracting insects, we want to try to mimic nature. So we want to plant in what we call drifts. So drifts are basically just like a flow. So think of like a wave or a winding river. So you can create drifts that you can have pockets, and you can see, and this is an overhead, but like just imagine like up here where it says number 6 and 7, these are all low growing plants. And then imagine the number 10 behind it is a little taller. So you have these flows of different colors and sizes, and then you're tiering them as you go. But you're creating kind of like a pattern, and that will help you to somewhat mimic nature. And that's what pollinators are looking. They don't care if it's in symmetry. And if you are planting a pollinator garden for aesthetic purposes, honestly, this looks 1,000 times better when it grows in, because it looks more natural. It just looks better, hands down. This is kind of more like when you think about like looking up online, look up like cottage gardens. You know, they have that kind of winding flow to them. And that's kind of what you're going for. You know, you can repeat the types of plants, and it's going to create a better visual impact. And you can see in this first one, you know, there's different groupings like I talked about, but some of the lower ground covers, you know, it's kind of flowing around the trees a little bit. It's not the best example, but it's, you know, you can create winding patterns. They could have created, if these were fruit trees here, they could have created some pathways up to those fruit trees by winding in the lower things, maybe even going around the back up against the fence and created some little paths. This picture here also reminds me, when we're talking about pollinators, we don't necessarily have to only focus on flowers. How many of you here grow or have citrus trees? You know, citrus trees are a great thing for pollinators. They're heavy bloomers. They're the host plant for the giant swallowtail. So you can incorporate in usable items into a pollinator garden. And then here, if I had a medium-sized tree here, I'm actually maybe going to provide a little bit of shade if it's positioned right to help relieve some stress and watering stress from some of these plants. So you can do this as understory plantings to other things, and you'd be surprised how they'll thrive. In the past couple of years, you know, we've done most of our flowers and garden under oaks. We have 4 giant oaks in our front yard, so you would think by looking at the majority of it, it's all shade. We get only like a smidge of hot afternoon sun, and then after that it's more filtered light. Everything grows immaculately. There's a handful of things that don't bloom like they should, but I don't have half the problems that most gardeners do, because these overstory trees are actually providing relief. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Sunlight is oftentimes too intense here, and filtered light actually goes a long way. So you can think about that when you're planning out some of these plants. You know, you might not think they're getting enough light, but they actually will. And the only way you're going to find that out in your own environment is to experiment.
What kind of trees would you like plant in a pollinator bed? I mean, you said citrus, but
you could do citrus if you want something that's flowering. I mean, I'm going to say this, but you know, some people, depends on the kind of people we got in the room today. Some people, depending on how much you talk about pollinators, Vitex is a great option. Vitex is controversial to some people because it can be evasive, you know, if you don't maintain. But I mean, it's a beautiful tree, and it blooms, and it is drought tolerant. So it's another a good option for a plant that requires little to no care. And it's, you know, it's going to go probably dormant in the winter, but it'll come back. So that would be a good option. Another one that you could do that's a native that I like, if you're just looking for more ornamental, less flowering, but actually will attract pollinators, would be the, oh man, I'm going to draw a total blank. It's a Yopon. It's the something Houston Yopon, and I'm going to forget. But it's a tree. It's not a shrub, but it looks like a dwarf Yopon leaf, and it's a native. It'll put on the red berries. You know, it doesn't have thorns, but it's small leaf. But it's a it'll make a pretty like medium-sized tree, and you can prune it up, have a nice canopy. It does really, really well. I see just like we have a few of them behind the greenhouse. And there was a bunch of pollinators on them the other day, actually. So it had some little blooms. They're not beautiful blooms, but they serve a purpose. So.
What about elderberry?
I mean, elderberries. I feel like elderberry is kind of invincible. There's one over there growing through the fence in the shade cloth area that I've been trying to cut down forever just because it's in the wrong place, but Donna won't let me. So, but yeah.
I didn't know if it would attract.
So if we've kind of got some concepts of actual planting, we want to make sure that we're including plants in our plan that are going to bloom year round. So we need early, mid, and late season bloomers. 9 times out of 10, everybody takes care of the early and mid season. Not enough people plant late season bloomers. They're a little more difficult, and everybody knows around here if you go shopping for plants in the fall, color and things are not as prominent as they are in the spring. So bloom timing is important because our goal here, if we're building a pollinator garden, how many of you like to eat only part of the year? So we're supporting nature. So if we're going to spend this time and effort, we want to have something that is going to help put out pollen and nectar to the best of our ability for the longest amount of time. We can't get every aspect of the year because we can't control Mother Nature, but we can get a lot. And it helps us prevent seasonal gaps. And if we can create more consistent pollinator resources, then we're more likely to have an abundance of pollinators in our garden consistently. So next we got to talk about flowers. So different shapes attract different pollinators. Not every pollinator is going to use the exact same type of flower. Now some of them will use many or all types, but we have to make sure that we have different shapes. As we think about a hummingbird, what kind of flower does a hummingbird feed from? A tubular flower. They've got a long beak. That's where they feed on those sugars. Same thing goes for sugar bats. A lot of them have a longer snout, so they can stick it in flowers and they can get it. How many of you love tomato hornworms or tobacco hornworms? Nobody loves them, but the sphinx moth is the size of a hummingbird, and it is a very, very efficient nighttime pollinator. Pollinates night blooming, I think it's some of the night blooming cactus, cirrus. They pollinate, I forget what else. There was something else that I'm going to draw a blank today. But things that we often look right out of the gate and they're like, that's bad. Yes, there are times where we have to control. But if you get into if you grow tomatoes and it's late season, you've gotten the majority of your harvest and you start getting hornworms as it gets hotter. We've left them before and let them complete their life cycle, but we'd already gotten most of our produce. We had a few tomatoes left and we weren't making any more. They were going to ripen one way or the other, with or without the foliage. So we left them. So because we knew they were going to turn into pollinators. But if they're in the middle of the season and the plants aren't, they're not ripening yet and they're full, we might have to do something about it. But we have creating diverse amount of plants too. We have to think about smells, the shapes. We talked about sight. Pollinators are going to find things by color that are in their spectrum. Some are going to find things by scent. It's the same reason why we plant. If you think about how many of you plant certain types of flowers or plants to repel insects. There's different types of scents that we might not as human be able to register without rubbing or releasing oils from the plant, but insects don't smell the same way as we do, and they can find plants by scent. So we've got to have a wide array. We also need things that are going to provide different types of pollen and nectar. The simplest example to give you about this, what's the most prominent type of pollen in Southeast Texas? Everybody hates it. Pine pollen.
Pine.
It covers everything.
Yeah.
So we have the most prominent pollen that we see fall out there. You know, the imported honeybee can't use pine pollen. It doesn't have enough protein. So here's this abundant resource, and it's not usable by one of the, the most attracted that's what everybody's trying to attract, bees. But at the end of the day, if we don't have the right type of pollen or different varieties that are going to provide the right types of proteins and sugars, then we might not be able to get the pollinators we actually want. So, and I can't ask them what they need, what they want, like how much protein you want in your protein bar or whatever. But by creating diversity out there and researching what types of flowers are going to attract the things that you're wanting to bring in, and you can kind of level up your game in getting those pollinators. Then having diversity, it's going to increase resilience. That's important. You're supporting the ecosystem by having a set of resilient pollinators that can find something. And as everything else, things evolve just like we do. Insects evolve. Sometimes they learn, and I'm sure over time, or our lifetime, some of these insects are now able to feed and use things that once before our time they couldn't. So if we're looking at different shapes, we're going to talk about 3 or 4 of the main types of flowers. So one of the most common flowers that you're going to have is like a flat or open face flower. So we think about a lot of our annual flowers, like zinnias qualify kind of as an open face flower. We have coneflower, black-eyed Susan, the rudbeckia are great, really resilient options for our area. And they're going to be very well at attracting bees and hummingbirds. The pollen and nectar access is very, very accessible to almost all types. Maybe not so much like a hummingbird or a sole sugar feeding, because we don't have that tubular section. Next, we're going to have 2 flowers. So things like salvia, Turk's cap, those are 2 are not completely native, but there are native varieties. There's blue mealy sage, which is in the salvia family, Turk's cap, that are going to have those tubular flowers that are going to be highly attractive to hummingbirds, butterflies. They'll even, obviously, if you ever planted, salvia, you know that bumblebees, they love them. So a very, very, very diverse set. Some of these tubular flowers are really, really good for our area because they're really drought tolerant. Once you get them established, there's no to little care involved, supplemental watering during the hot summer, but overall, they're going to do really well. And they're going to bloom all season, which is really, really important. Next, we have composite flowers. How many of you love goldenrod? Nobody. But goldenrod is, when we talk about, on the other hand, how like honeybees don't like pine pollen, or they don't like it, they have no use for it. Goldenrod, we as humans don't like it because of allergies, but it is one of the primary pollen sources and nectar sources for honeybees in the fall season. It's kind of falls back like, I guess not so many people love pine trees anymore like it was whenever I was, when I was younger, like they were everywhere. But it's like the tallow tree. The tallow tree is your main pollen and nectar flow for honeybees. How many do you see tallow trees around the neighborhoods nowadays? There's not many of them. So you think about how we're detracting from bringing in these things that we're looking for, and then we can't get them to stick around because we don't have abundance of what they need. So goldenrod is really important. Without goldenrod in the fall, we'd have a really hard time keeping any bee population here because that's the primary food source for imported honeybee. Lantana is also a composite flower. So a composite flower essentially is a pattern of flowers on a head, and it's made up of many flowers. So every one of the little spots on the lantana is an individual flower. And that's important because every one of those flowers holds pollen and nectar. So instead of having one big flower, now we have hundreds of little flowers that are holding resources. So it makes it a little bit more accessible. It also makes it easier to keep that going year round. And that was one thing I love about using like native lantana in a pollinator garden, because it's a plant one time most of the time, and it's going to come back year after year, and it's going to bloom all summer long, just like some of your sages or salvias. So you're going to have consistent color. And you can also get your lantanas in different colors, so you can fulfill some of your color changes by having some of the same plants. And a lot of your composite flowers are going to be very, very high in nectar production. Next, we have cluster flowers. So cluster flower, basically, you've got a big stalk, and it's going to come out and it's going to have a bunch of flowers, and it kind of looks like one big bloom, essentially, but it's a bunch of smaller flowers. So that's going to be primarily found on things like dill, fennel, parsley, even maybe some of your vegetables that actually will bolt and shoot out flower stalks. So not only do these support pollinators, they also support beneficial predators. If we're going to build a pollinator garden, yeah, we want to attract in a bunch of pollinators, but at the same time, if we don't have any source of regulation, creating an abundance of something is never a good thing. So having beneficial predators in our garden, like a good example is the red paper wasp. You know, we see them everywhere. They're building nests all over the place in places we don't want them to, but oftentimes, if you have a diverse environment, we've found in our home that they'll come back and we'll find them in the same locations year after year, and they never bother us, not one time. My kid can go running, screaming through the garden. He can be smacking on things, and they never bother him because they have their own little shelter. They're hidden in a plant or somewhere out of the way, and now I've got all this stuff for them to be able to venture, get sugars, pollen. I've got water source. I've got caterpillars for them to go and find. Yeah, and sometimes they might pick up a beneficial caterpillar. I've seen them pick up a swallowtail caterpillar before and fly off with it. But it's not my job to save everything out there. I got what I needed. They got what they needed, and they're helping keep balance. Because at the end of the day, creating a pollinator garden is supporting nature. Dill is one of our personal favorites in the herb family because that's going to be, what's the variety? Is it the the dill supports the eastern swallowtail butterfly. So we've had one dill plant for 2.5 years. It's been eaten to the ground. It's survived winter. It has produced more pollinators than I could ever imagine, and we've gotten more harvest out of this one plant. I got more dill than I could ever do anything with. So herbs are a way that we can not only get usable items for us from a culinary perspective, or maybe Carrie's been experimenting back there making like Epsom salts with like rosemary and using herbs for other purposes. So we have things that we're harvesting using, but we're also providing enough of it, even with one plant, to support pollinators. So sometimes we need to be placing things in there that they may not actually be pollinating, but we're providing host. Like we talk about milkweed, you know, we're providing a host plant. Milkweed flower, I mean, it's pretty, but it's not the most beautiful flower out there, but it's very usable. So being intentional and supporting all life stages of pollinators, herbs can play a huge part of that. Basil, hands down, probably my favorite plant to have in the garden. And even if you plant no other herbs in a pollinator garden, basil's worth its weight in gold if you choose a good flowering basil. Your Thai basil, if you can find African blue basil somewhere. Lemon basil has done us really well, and even cinnamon basil. They flower consistently. They attract, you know, bumblebees, butterflies, honeybees. And the last one I'll mention that has never let us down is pineapple sage. Falls in that salvia family, but it's usable. You can make teas with it. It smells really wonderful. It gets really, really woody, and it puts on bright red tubular flowers. They're not very, very big, but it'll bloom all summer long, and it will bring in hummingbirds. We already had first hummingbird hit it the other day. But we'll see. That's the one plant that I'll find more bees between that and the basil that are adjacent to each other. That's like the hot spot. And two, another thing that a lot of people, like the night blooming, like Ceres, think about having plants or, research and do homework. I'm not the most savvy at it. There's a few of them out there, but try to find some plants that you can put out that are night blooming. We might not get the beauty or the benefit of it, but we can support moths. A lot of the worms and things that we deal with in the garden or around the yard turn into moths, and they've got to have things too, and they're efficient pollinators. We did an African blue basil. It was probably about 5 years ago, and we had one plant, and it was probably about 4 foot in diameter. And I went outside in the yard to find something at night with a flashlight, and panned across it, and it was just covered in moths. And that's the first time I really ever thought about, okay, what does a moth do? Just think of it a nuisance thing sometimes, but they were out there steadily pollinating and getting what they needed to continue their life cycle. So it's pretty cool. A few plants that you can utilize as well, the Turk's cap. If you plant like natives Turk's cap, especially the larger ones, one plant's sufficient. That's something you can put out in your landscape. You can build a pollinator garden around it. So this could be something you use as a staple point, maybe not a tree, but it's large. It's very hardy, drought tolerant, will come back year after year, and you can utilize that as a center point. Passion vine. Passion vine is one of my favorite. That's going to be your host plant. The purple passion vine will be your host plant for the Gulf fritillary caterpillar or the butterfly. We have one in one of our garden beds. I don't necessarily advise you to put it in a garden bed, but we keep it trimmed, and that's one of the few things we have to weed out as it spreads along. But not every year, but every couple years, it'll get covered up in the caterpillars, and we'll see tons of butterfly activity throughout the entire season. And it's a simple, easy plant. It dies back every year, and it comes back, and it'll grow as big as you let it. We just keep ours trimmed for the most part. And mine doesn't flower a whole lot because I don't think it gets enough sun. It might this year. We've had some environmental changes in our garden, but it's one that even sometimes without flowers, you still can get those caterpillars coming on there, and you provide a host plant. But if it does bloom, it's one of the coolest flowers, I think, to ever exist. So, but you don't want the red one that's out there is not good for the fritillary caterpillar. And I think the white one might be okay, but the white one is not real popular. Coreopsis is one that is underrated, super easy. It's a low-growing plant. You can mix that in. Definitely a good option. And if you are a native planter, the bluebonnet, if you like bluebonnets or have bluebonnet patches, it's worth keeping going because they're early nectar producers. So early in the spring, when not everything is really flowering or flourishing yet, bluebonnets do provide nectar for pollinators. So, and that's one of those ones you can have, fill an empty space for part of the season early on, and then as it attrits out, blooming goes away, then it dies off, and then it's going to stratify again, and it may come back again. So easy option for early season use. At any point in time, if we can, ideally we want to try to choose native varieties. The Turk's cap, the mealy sage, flowering shrubs that are native that will bring in pollinators, like I was talking about that yopon. Even Texas sage will bring some pollinator benefit. It's not the highest in nectar content, but it does bring in consistent blooms. I think there are some rudbeckias that are native to this area. But essentially, finding varieties that are going to be more resilient, that are going to require less inputs. Because if we can grow more native varieties, we're going to be watering less, we're going to be fertilizing less, they're going to be more adept to the soil and the conditions we have. They're going to grow in crummy conditions where other things might not. And they're going to provide stronger pollinator support, because if we have native plantings or native species in a given area, then we're going to support more native pollinators. And One of the things that a lot of people don't realize, a lot of like singular native pollinators, like so different species of like solitary bees, they're far more efficient pollinators than even a colony of honeybees. So, you know, a set of solitary bees, one here, one there, oftentimes they're more prone to pollinate things that grow naturally in a region, and they're going to pollinate them very efficiently because they only use certain things, because that's kind of part of their life cycle. It also brings me to, if you're going to have native plants or anything for that matter, and I go all the way back to the beginning here. How many of you would like to live without a house? How many of you would like to live without water? So we're providing food. We have to think about, if we're going to keep a pollinator garden and we're going to try to attract consistent pollinators, we've got to have shelter. That doesn't mean you got to have a fancy bug house, but you got to think about ways that you can mimic nature to provide shelter. Solitary bees are a good example. A couple years ago, we started using bamboo stakes to make like a little teepee trellis for things to grow on. And next thing I know, I have solitary bees living in the tops of the bamboo poles. So you think about little bee houses with the cardboard tubes. That's essentially what you're mimicking, is these little tubes where they crawl in. There's a single entry point, so they can protect it. And that's where they lay their eggs or whatever to create their life cycle. So you can create different things, and they don't have to be in a sheltered house. You can have, some people will cut bamboo, lay it on the ground. So all kinds of different ways that you can mimic this. It's like ladybugs, trying to keep ladybugs as predators in the garden. If you don't have water or shelter, they're not going to stick around. So we have to think about those things. It's something I would encourage you to research, because it will create a better condition for keeping the things we want around. Another thing is water, clean water. Virtually every insect, just like us, needs water. They need accessible water. We keep, in our garden, we keep a little pot like this and glued a saucer to the top of it. And when it's filled with rocks, and every time I'm out in the garden, it sits in one of the beds. And every time I'm out there, I just make sure it's got water in it. And if it gets dirty, I dump the rocks out, I clean it out, and I put them back, and I start over. But I keep accessible landing areas and water at all times. I mean, how many of you have ever been in any source of water and you've had like a wasp or a bee fly out you while if you're in a swimming pool or something? They're going to go to the closest, most accessible water source possible. And just like us, they're creatures of convenience. We're not going to drive. I'm not going to drive to Beaumont to go to the grocery store unless there's just something I really got to have. I can only get there. So creating things that are very, very locally centered will help you keep things around and create a healthier environment. Some of the common mistakes that people make are, not grouping. We kind of already covered this, but just want to touch on it again. If you're not creating groupings of multiple plants, you could be getting more benefit from what you're doing. No fall blooms, not considering fall. Not everybody grows a garden or grows plants in the fall, but we're lucky enough to live in a place where we can grow something year-round, virtually all the time. So we want to support that if we can. Secondly, overcrowding. How many of you have ever planted things too close together? A lot of these plants are going to spread naturally. Like I mentioned salvia earlier. Salvia is going to spread. A lot of these things we're going to buy them. We might not start them all from seed. Some things we might not be able to start from seed because we didn't time it right. If it's things that have to be cold stratified, like bluebonnets, like Indian paintbrush. There's other ones, you've got to plant them in the fall to get them to overwinter and get scarred in the soil in order to be able to germinate. So a lot of times we're going out and we're buying things. So we want to make sure that we're putting them out, that we're planting them with space in mind. I experience this in a different facet in landscaping. I see competitors or people I even know, they'll plant some beautiful landscapes, but like in 6 months, it's going to be so close together, it's not going to look good anymore, and those plants are going to begin to compete against each other, and things are going to struggle. So creating spacing so that whenever things begin to grow in, it's gonna fill out. You just gotta be a little patient and focus on the end game being a little later. So, a couple things that I don't have on here. There's 2 other plants that you can plant that are good native examples, like coral honeysuckle. Frog fruit is a good one. It's a ground cover that's actually pollinator friendly. The biggest thing that I didn't put on my slideshow today is if we're going to create a pollinator garden, what's one thing that you guys could think that we should not do if we can avoid it at all cost? So we're trying to attract bugs. Pesticides. I feel in a sense, being pesticide free is often difficult here because it's a warm climate, it's hot. And if we're going to be attracting these insects in, we have to do our best to be pesticide free, because even though we spray something, residuals of chemicals stick around. And then even if we don't necessarily damage the insect directly, by using an abundance of pesticides in the garden or in a pollinator area, we spray it on a plant for a particular reason. Maybe even if we're just spraying for mosquitoes around plants, those things go in the soil. They damage microorganisms in the soil. The microorganisms are vital for helping plants be resilient and get nutrients. If the plant can't get the nutrients it needs, then it can't produce the high caliber sugars and pollen that the pollinators need. So not only can we affect them by contact, but we can also affect them by damaging the overall ecosystem. So you keep that in mind when you're utilizing things. If you are, like somebody asked earlier, well, what about I gotta spray the yard for mosquitoes and things. Be mindful about if you are going to use things, when you're using it. Be mindful about things like wind. Microparticles go everywhere. So you got to keep those kind of things in mind and know that if you do, try to keep them away from the beneficial things if at all possible. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to be, at least for me, I'm trying to be a steward of the soil and trying to create the best quality produce, because everything I'm doing for pollinators or really for vegetable and fruit production is what I'm gauging it towards. But I want to have nutritious stuff. So, and truthfully speaking, I find that while I don't have enough, in my opinion, utilizing herbs as the forefront and then focusing in with lots of different flowers, shapes and colors have truly made it to where I can be virtually pesticide free, organic or not. I sprayed my first chemical, because everything's a chemical, organic or not. I sprayed my first pesticide the other day because we had armyworms on the tomatoes, and we haven't got the first ripe fruit off our paste tomatoes, and I'm not losing them because they're loaded. And we went 2 days and the whole side of a plant, you could just see the damage moving. So I have a choice, but I selectively sprayed that. But that particular product I use doesn't know the difference between a good worm and a bad worm. So sometimes you have to mitigate what you're trying to get out of your environment and make that choice. Sometimes it's necessary, but most times it's not. So that's kind of my spiel for today, I think. Does anybody have any questions?
That was good.
All right, cool.
Informative. Well, I think you covered everything.
I hope so. I learned a lot from this, and it sounds really silly, but this is the first time I've ever done this particular this class. So that's one of the reasons why I do these, because it forces me to learn more. So I learned a lot preparing for this. Carrie prepared most of this, and then I learned from. So give her credit back there.
Hey, when is your podcast?
What is it?
When?
It releases every Tuesday.
Okay, so we can access it anytime.
Yeah, so all the podcasts are on YouTube as well.
Okay.
Like all the videos are on YouTube. I posted 2 new videos today. I was talking about the worms or the caterpillars. Posted my video about that. Kind of going through the whole regiment that I take to decide whether I'm going to spray it or not. We just did one on blossom end rot today. So I have like 3 or 4 videos every week plus the podcast. So And then the podcast is on every platform imaginable except maybe like 2 that you have to pay to be on.
Okay.
We're not doing that. So,
Gotcha.
yeah.
So it's just a compact.
He put out a good one this week with Michael at the Giving Field.
Yeah, we did. We did one. We did a couple little short episodes just talking about the giving field and talking about some of the common problems that people face. So, yeah, my goal of the podcast is just to like, I'm not gonna say basic information, but like, I do this because it's so hard to find the information that you want out there without all the fluff. And I feel like, I don't know if anybody's like me, I don't have time for all the fluff. So I got too many other things to do. So trying to just like get down to the bare bones of it and like drive home principles. So it's fun.
Always up this morning at work.
Yeah, cool.
That's cool. So just YouTube the compost pile?
Yep.
Okay.
I thought you were working.
Hey, I'd say that's work. So. Awesome. No other questions today?
Have you do anything on soil amendments, things like that?
I do have a soil class up there. I don't know, like if you haven't, like the very first episode I did of my podcast is strictly about soil. Because I think that's the most important thing. Like, everything that you do growing, you might as well not even be doing anything if you're not very and that, yeah. I would like to try to, we're going to try hopefully this summer when we're out of the hefty part of the season to bring in some more guests for some classes. And I'd like to try to get my friend Luis tomorrow to come back in and do a soil talk again. Because some of the best places to learn about soil and what goes into soil, so you really have an understanding of like what you're buying and what makes the difference between a good soil and a bad soil when you buy it. There's no better person to learn that from than somebody who actually makes soil. So, and it's a cool process.
What's your opinion about colored mulches?
I'm not necessarily a fan. Do I use them from time to time? Sure, but I'm very, very selective about which ones I use. A lot of your colored mulches, and that's what mulch gets a bad rap for a lot of people, because if you go right now, you can go to the big box store and you can buy 5 bags for $10. But if you really break open that bag and you look at the particles, is what you need to focus on. What shape and size of material is in the bag? And a lot of the dyes that are out there are bound to, they need woods that are very high in carbon to bond the dye to. So you get big chunky thick blocks. Whereas if you get a good quality one, like we have like the heirloom soils, like black colored mulch. It's the only dyed mulch. I have one other one, but we don't even talk about that one. But it's shredded. So it's shredded just like all your natural woods, like your hardwoods. It's made from natural hardwoods. So the hardwood mulch that we sell next door that's composted, it's the exact same mulch, except it has a carbon-based dye on it. But a lot of the dyes are not necessarily healthy for the soil, but if you're very selective about it and you buy I'm not gonna say expensive, but a good quality dyed mulch, it will break down. And that's what you're looking for. You need particles, and your mulch is designed to break down. It feeds the soil. Most people want to buy the mulch and they want it to stay colorful and they want it to be there for like 2 years. And like that's not what mulch is for. It is there for that, but it's designed to break down. You're feeding the microorganisms. And if you use the wrong kind of dyed mulch, these people, they end up starving their plants of nutrients. You can get nitrogen fixation, where you bind up all your nitrogen in the soil because these large particles, they don't ever want to break down. So the composting phase is so long. So then you end up getting plants that are starving for nutrients because the soil is taking it away from it. So I'm not a fan, but if you're using a very high quality one, that's all right. I try to stick, like in my landscape company, we almost primarily only use hardwood mulch. Because it looks good with any color palette. All mulch is going to lose color. I mean, it's a living thing. But you can keep the mulch looking good if you go out, and nobody wants to do this, but It also helps with weed control. You go out and just periodically rake it, turn it over, because a lot of the weeds that are growing in that mulch, as it breaks down and becomes soil, they're growing in those finer particles, so you can disrupt the root system. And oftentimes you can kind of flip it, and underneath the color is still rich, but the top gets sun faded, so you can kind of turn it, fluff it a little bit, and it'll stay looking good longer. But it's just not something that everybody jumps out there and does. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, appreciate you guys coming.